You're about to listen to the Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders, for coders, about all aspects of life as a developer.
I'm Will, the curmudgeonly experienced developer.
And I'm Beej, the optimistic newbie developer. Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast. This week, we are talking about Scrum project management. Scrum fits into the model of Agile Software Development and was first introduced in the 1990s. We'll take a look at the theory and values underlying Scrum before diving into the details. Next, we'll discuss the various roles on a Scrum team and how they relate to each other and the project as a whole. The episode will close out with a discussion of the biggest part of Scrum, the sprint. But before we get started, Will, what have you been finding this week?
Just a lot of different stuff. I've been playing pretty heavily with .NET Core. I've also been playing with Delphi.
That's cool.
I've also been playing with integrating .NET and Delphi, both directions. I'm writing a spec for message queuing and API endpoints for work. So I actually got 3 or 4 hours in yesterday afternoon because I got home and I wanted to do something and I didn't want to do any of my stuff. So I just remoted into work and did some of the lingering items there that I needed to do. So it was stuff like, we had previous developers that could not bring a Delphi DLL into .NET and actually call it because they didn't understand things like how the garbage collector affects the heap in C#. And stuff that really ought to be basic, but apparently they couldn't do it. And so, I had a DLL that was a test DLL, and it's like, oh yeah, here, pass this image and we'll shrink it and pass it back to you in memory. So you pass a pointer to.
Well, these people that had not used or had not written in a low level language?
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into imprecations. But they spent a great deal of time on it. And so I spent 18 minutes and wrote, got it connected and, get a pointer to the bitmap, pin the bitmap in memory, get a pointer to it, send the pointer to Wayne, who's, it's his DLL, resize the bitmap, get a pointer back from him, take that, turn it into a .NET bitmap, serialize the disk.
Huh.
It was next to nothing. And of course I still have to load test it. I got to make sure it doesn't leak memory, leak handles and all that. I'm pretty sure it doesn't because I tend to be kind of anal retentive about that anyway.
About everything?
Yeah. But that's a huge point. And then we're looking at, bigger pieces, at an architectural level for our software as well. And one of those pieces is actually replacing a lot of polling loops with message queuing technology. And so I've got to, have a sample in .NET, which is no problem because I've done this 3 or 4 times now. But the other part is I have to do something similar in Delphi because I got to be able to talk over the wire that way. And then there's the discussion of how we're going to do our API and webhooks, which also ties into that same thing because, this is for customers talking to our app and just starting to line all that out and, spitball ideas. So yeah, that's what I've been doing. I've been all over the place the last week and a half.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
So, how about you?
Well, I had a date this past weekend. I've been so busy with with the getting the job and my side projects and building up the podcast and the Code Newbie Nashville stuff that I had forgotten how much fun it can be to go out with someone that I haven't known for years.
Yeah.
Just getting to know someone new is a lot of fun.
Getting your life back is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what's going on with you.
Yeah. And it's kind of cool. I'm going to be calling her tonight after I leave here from recording. She's about as busy as I am, so we even schedule our phone calls.
Do you schedule the start of the phone call or the duration of the phone call?
Usually just the start, and
you don't keep minutes or anything like that. That's good.
No.
That might be a little much.
Yeah, we're not that nerdy. I will say this: she has read Tolkien, so when she said that she was into fantasy, I asked her what she liked, and when Tolkien came up, I was like, "Oh, you really are into fantasy."
Yeah.
I'm still loving my job. The project I'm on is their first foray into Scrum project management. And I've been watching videos about that that the Scrum Master sent me. The videos, they're not bad. And they have a lot of good information, but...
you got annoyed with the sound effects, didn't you?
Yes. Oh, my goodness. They have this sound effect for writing on the whiteboard that sounds nothing like a marker on a whiteboard and sounds more like a dying cat clawing a chalkboard.
Nice. Yeah, having a podcast really ruins your appreciation of audio made by other people. I've noticed, true. Like, because I listen to a bunch of different podcasts, and I'm like, oh, equalize your stuff, man. You know?
Yeah, it's I've gotten pickier about the podcasts I listen to since we started.
And just things that like you would never notice before. Like, I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago, and their content was interesting, but they had like this music piece for the first 2 minutes. No talking, just that same music. Every time I'm like, I'm not listening to this. Like, you're wasting 2 minutes of my time a day.
That's actually something that Aaron Dow talks about on his show is your intro and your outro. And you want to make it have enough information that people first time listening understand what the show's about, but you don't want it to be so long that people who are regular listeners skip over it.
Yeah, I forget how that was put to me. It was another context, but it was basically the idea that planes that require long runways tend to crash. You know?
Yeah. I've been doing my own research into Scrum, and that led to this episode outline. And I did want to point out one thing. I have still been getting calls from recruiters. I want to say, even when you've got a job,
especially when you have a job.
Yeah, especially when you have a job, be polite to the recruiters, because you want them to think of you when and if you're looking again. If you're on, like I am, I'm contract. So when this contract is up, if I don't get brought on permanently, I'm going to be looking again. And I want those recruiters that are calling me now, I want them to call me then and say, hey, we got this position for you. I want them to think of me and think, hey, that guy was nice even when he already had a job and didn't have to be nice to me.
Yeah, because you and I both know a few developers that get snippy with recruiters. And it's like, look, they're just trying to do their job.
Mm-hmm. Just keep that in mind, guys, that when you need the recruiters to help you find a job or to point you towards the jobs, they're going to remember who was nice to them and who wasn't.
Yeah. Well, and it's just, why make the world a little worse?
Yeah. So I have something that kind of relates to the topic for IoT. So let's go ahead and roll the music. So this week for IoTs, I have something a little bit different, but it relates to the topic at hand, and it is an article on how to start an IoT project team. Since this episode is about project management, I wanted to highlight a blog post by Tim Clark that I read a while back about building an IoT project team. It's well written and designed specifically for project managers leading their first Internet of Things team. In the post, he gives 11 tips for starting an IoT project team, including understanding the big picture, IoT reference architecture, picking the team and the team lead, and learning fog computing. Now, this is an informative and very encouraging article for any project managers looking to work in IoT. I do have a quote from the end of the article that I want to read. It says, "You're not just another IT project manager. You're an IoT project manager with hard-won proficiency in this emerging field." And sort of gives you guys an idea of the encouraging nature of the article and just how well it was written. So I have a link to that in our show notes. Who's talking to us this week?
This week we have a comment from Lucretius000 saying, "I'm relatively new to the world of code, and this podcast is a great way to learn about a variety of topics in software development. Highly recommended for anyone interested in learning more about software development, especially from the perspective of newcomers to the industry." Well, thanks, Lucretius000. I kind of have a feeling I know who that is.
We've got some complete developer swag just for you. And if you guys would like some CDP swag, write us a review in iTunes. You could also comment on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, or LinkedIn. We definitely check those a few times a day, or go to the website and start a conversation on one of the shows. We'd love to talk to our listeners and get ideas from you guys. So, Scrum is a framework for implementing project management in Agile software development. It is defined by the Scrum Alliance as a framework within which people can address complex adaptive problems while productively and creatively delivering products of highest possible value. The majority of the outline for this episode actually comes from materials produced by the Scrum Alliance. And for even more detailed information, you can visit their website, which is linked in our show notes. A little history about project management. In response to trends of project management for software development back in the 70s and 80s, several methodologies were developed and became popular during the 90s. Scrum was first presented by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland in 1995 at the OOPSLA, or is that OOPSLA?
I guess so.
Conference. And
I think they were in the chocolate factory, weren't they, with Charlie? So much of OOPSLA is coming.
They basically documented the process that they had learned and developed around Scrum. The term Agile Software Development came about in 2001 with the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And to get a bit pedantic here, the term Agile is an adjective to describe software development. However, it has been turned into a noun because, as Dave Thomas, one of the writers of the Manifesto, says, you can sell a noun. You've seen that video, haven't you?
Yeah.
Throughout this episode, we're going to talk about how Scrum is designed to be used, and then give some examples of how it can be misunderstood or misused.
Yeah, and I got a fair bit of this coming up because waterfall was the big thing when I started. Mm-hmm. Because it was like 2 years after that manifesto, and obviously that hadn't hit corporate politics very much yet. And the thing with waterfall was it was the big design up front and the long iteration cycle, and then you get done. And of course, that actually wasn't in the waterfall paper either.
No.
But they went ahead and did it. And what ended up really happening that forced Scrum into the limelight was the internet and that faster iteration cycle. Like, people had to react.
It seems to me that when done properly, Scrum is similar to what waterfall was intended to be.
Yep.
In that it is a short waterfall.
Well, it's waterfall with constraints on it that force it to actually happen.
Yes.
Because otherwise waterfall gets under project management and becomes water fail.
Yeah.
The same thing will happen to Agile. It's just now we call that fragile.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did title the outline for this Scrum Lord.
Yeah, and that's a term I used for our Scrum manager at a previous job, who's actually pretty good at it. But I was just like, you don't want to be Scrum Master, you want to be Scrum Lord. I mean, come on. That just sounds better.
Yeah. So we're going to start off talking about the Scrum theory. And I have a quote here from Michael James. Scrum's early advocates were inspired by empirical inspect and adapt feedback loops to cope with complexity and risk. Scrum theory has three main components: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. And with transparency, aspects of the process are made visible to those responsible for the outcome. And this is defined by a common standard. Inspection involves frequently inspecting the Scrum process to detect variances.
Yeah, and that goes into everything from like retrospectives all the way down to like looking at the burn down chart day by day.
Mm-hmm.
It's so you can adjust. It's a feedback loop based system versus a deterministic system.
Yeah. The trick here is that inspection should not get in the way of work.
Right.
And that's one.
And you're on the first team that I've heard of that happens.
Yeah.
So good luck to you.
And then finally, adaptation. And these are adjustments based on that inspection. There are 4 formal events for inspection and adaptation. And we'll kind of mention them. Those are sprint planning, your daily scrum, the sprint review, and then the sprint retrospective. And we're going to talk about these in much more detail when we get down to talking about sprints.
Yeah, and the biggest thing, honestly, that I find that guides the value of the Scrum process is actually the core values. So it's, implementation is one thing, but the values that are there tend to guide towards that implementation anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like separation of concerns makes you make objects that are granular over time and, do one thing and do it well. Like that design choice will be forced. It's the same kind of thing with Scrum. The core values really go into it. So.
And there are 5 core values: focus, courage, openness, commitment, and respect. And focus is doing just a few things at a time. And this creates a team that works well together to be able to deliver valuable items sooner.
Yeah, because you don't want to get after too many things at once
or tackle too big of a project at once. You want to break down the bigger tasks or bigger stories into smaller tasks.
Yeah. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day and it wasn't built in a sprint.
Yes. Very, very true. Courage, by providing support and resources to each other as a team, you're able to undertake greater challenges than by doing it alone.
Yeah. And team cohesion is a big part of this as well, too.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads into openness, which is to express what you're doing, to address challenges and concerns to the entire team.
Yeah, and actually have a board of, or have some kind of resource that says, hey, here's what we're doing. Yeah. Not, in other words, like if I'm working with you on a team, I know what you're up to. Not, I'm not just shooting blind and checking things into source control that might break everything you're doing and make you miss a deadline. That just makes it easier for people to be conscientious.
Yeah, exactly. Commitment is control over your own destiny, leads to a team that is committed to success.
Yeah, and the big place where this comes in for me is that I can actually, if I'm working in an organization that properly implements Agile, or to some degree partially properly implements Agile, as it were, I can pick the tasks that I'm best suited for off the list and commit to doing those, because it's kind of your choice. You're sort of picking your fate.
Yes.
And so you're not forced into things that you're bad at doing or that you hate doing necessarily. You'll have to do some of those because there's certain things everybody hates,
and part of this too is the team takes the story and breaks it down into tasks.
Yeah, especially when you're doing things like planning poker and like the team can say, yes, we can do this in this many weeks. Not okay, the project manager said it or the sales guy said it.
Yeah,
because that makes the team uncommitted because they don't care if the guy said something wrong and got in trouble for it because he was an idiot that said something wrong and didn't check.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this is something that actually came up today in one of our meetings, was talking about commitment. And one of the things about where I work is the team got kind of pulled off of the project for a week, right in the middle of the sprint.
Ooh.
By higher ups, because this is, like I said, this is their first sprint project. That happened the week before I got there.
Ouch.
Yeah. So, which explains why there was a lot of stuff that was mostly done, and I came in and just sort of finished it up.
Yeah.
Which I told the other .NET developer that I think that was the perfect way for me to come in to the role, because all the really hard parts had been done. I was able to come in, read through what she had already written, understand it, and then put the finishing touches on it to make it work.
Yeah, that was a good way to come in.
Yeah, it made onboarding a lot easier because I was able to come in and get something, be productive quickly, based on the work that was already in there.
Yeah, and that level of respect is kind of a cornerstone of the Agile process, right? Like you know that you can count on your team, because when you're doing waterfall, a lot of times the isolation and the communication limitations really get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was probably pretty huge for you, and I imagine that garnered a lot of respect from the rest of the team as well, that you were able to get in and do something and at least be a little bit exothermic once you got in there.
Yeah, it really did. I mean, I feel like I'm making friends at work.
Yeah.
Which is good because I actually like the people I'm working with. So now that we've kind of talked about the background and the underlying theory and values of Scrum, I want to talk specifically about the roles within Scrum. And the first is the product owner. And the important thing here is this is one person, not a team or committee. And this is the person that creates and manages the product backlog and prioritizes.
I'm laughing about this because most of the places I've worked, that's not been how they've interpreted that.
Mm-hmm.
And, having this person, be one role, like having one final say, that's extremely important. Otherwise, the rest of it is really hard to get working.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And this is basically the person that prioritizes the wish list for the product. They order the items to best achieve the goals of the project and ensure transparency and understanding in that ordering. The big issue here is they have to avoid micromanagement.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to come in and micromanage the developers as they are trying to work as a development team or the Scrum team.
Yeah, they want to be separated from that role. Yeah. Plus, it makes it where they can make better decisions themselves, too. Like, they're not enmeshed in the whole thing.
Yes. Next is the Scrum Master. And the idea here is the servant leader. The goal is no managerial power over the team. And the Scrum Master serves the product owner by managing the backlog, helping the team to understand the backlog items, and ensuring that the product owner
stays where they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
I mean, to some degree, we talked about good managers, how some of them are crap funnels and some of them are crap umbrellas.
Yes.
Part of the Scrum Master's role is to be a crap umbrella.
Yes.
It's to keep the product owner off of the rest of the team.
And that's part of how they serve the development team. They also serve as a coach for self-organization and cross-functionality. One of the big roles that is highly emphasized where I work is removing impediments to progress. And they also facilitate the Scrum events, like scheduling the conference rooms and things like that.
Yeah. Make sure there's water in there.
Yeah.
Get the coffee ready. Because their role is really to smooth all the different pieces and try to be as conscientious as possible so that it all goes through.
And finally, we have the development team. This should be a small group of self-organizing workers. The ideal is for the team to be 3 to 9 people. Really, the smaller, the better.
Yeah.
So long as you can get
to a point.
Yeah, so long as you can get all of the functionality that you need for that sprint. And this is a cross-functional team with all the skills needed. So it will include programmers, business analysts, QA experts and testers, and UI designers. Another big thing here is there are no special titles or sub-teams.
Right, because you don't want silos forming.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do that, you're not doing Agile anymore.
Yeah.
Of course, the thing is, part of this is too, if you have a sub-team, that should be a team. They shouldn't be in your Scrum meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're doing an integration and then you're one team.
I have seen a little bit of the sub-teams where I work because we have the two of us working on the .NET side, working with the front end, doing Angular and JavaScript.
Yeah.
And so, we kind of work together like that, but there's a lot of cross between the two teams.
Yeah, and we have the same thing with our Delphi team and our .NET team. Of course, 2 of us are starting to kind of cross over a little bit. Like we're actually going to switch places.
Yeah.
More than likely. So that's helping with the team integration a lot. But yeah, you definitely don't want that silo behavior because it tends to create psychological causes of group dysfunction.
Yeah, exactly. So you've heard us talking about the backlog. So let's do a backlog breakdown. We'll start with the product backlog. This is an ordered list of everything needed, from features, functions, requirements, and fixes. It's a single source of all requirements for the project, and multiple teams can work on the same backlog. It's ordered by importance, with the higher order generally having more detail and being more structured and broken down. It's also something that isn't really ever finished. It's constantly being maintained and added to. That's what the product owner does, is he or she maintains and organizes this list. The development team creates estimates for each sprint based on the highest priority tasks or items on the list, which they bring into the sprint backlog, which is the items from the product backlog that are being worked on in the current sprint. All the work necessary to meet the sprint goal.
Right.
Is here.
Yeah, so you kind of want to limit that sprint backlog appropriately. Otherwise, it gets overwhelming. That's why you have two of them, because one of them, like, you have to legitimately have it for the project management, but for the actual developers getting in there, like, we don't want to see that whole pile of things because it's intimidating.
Yeah. Where I'm at, we have, like, I can go in and look at the entire project backlog if I want, or I can look at the current sprint, the previous sprint. I mean, we haven't come up with the next sprint yet because we haven't had the sprint planning meeting yet.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's, I can go back and look at what was done in the previous sprints, what's, you know, do this sprint, or I can look at all of it, kind of get an overview of what's going on. As new work is required, it is added to the backlog by the team. So one thing that we've been working with is they recently extended the sprints from 2 weeks to 3 weeks to allow testing.
Yeah, because a 2 week sprint is awful short.
Yeah, and so now we're having new tasks, which we had. You could add a new task to the sprint backlog, but now the testers can come in and add bugs, which are a different color.
Right. So
they show up, more prominently. Well, you've heard us talking about it. It's time to dive in to the sprint. I have another quote here from Michael James. Time is divided into short work cadences known as sprints, typically 1 week or 2 weeks long. The product is kept in a potentially shippable, properly integrated and tested state at all times.
Because you don't want to do what I've experienced where I'm working, which I've been kind of pushing back on, where your working code that's like actually out on dev or on QA doesn't work, is massively broken in some way because somebody did a bad push. Like, that's a big no-no because that ends up being the kind of thing that interrupts a sprint.
Yeah. Now, the goal of each sprint is an MVP, minimum viable product. And this product is presented to the product owner, the team, and any key shareholders at the end of the sprint. Done, as defined by the team and the product owner, varies.
Yes, it does.
And it becomes typically more detailed as the team gets better.
Yeah, and a lot of times what I see too is done is being defined as early in the process as being the harder parts kind of work.
Yeah.
And and then they're going to gradually refine. It's sort of like making a sculpture. You knock the big pieces off first.
Well, it's like I was talking to the other .NET developer and one of the front end guys today about something, and I said, I'm really, really struggling to get it to work. I may have to just brute force it for now and then come back and refactor it in the next sprint. And, we talked about that as a team and got the other guy in there, and we talked about it and decided to go with that. Of course, then I was explaining to our manager what was going on, and he solved the problem pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, and he told me, he said, the only reason I was able to do this is because I've had this problem before, and I did what you did, and then I came back and refactored later, and I just know the problem because I've seen it before.
And I'd seen it before too, if it's the one you were dealing with today.
Yeah.
But I'd forgotten what framework you were on, so I was like, well, that couldn't be it. But
yeah. To start off, each sprint you have a sprint planning meeting. This is where you determine what can be delivered in the sprint increment, how the work will be achieved, and this is where the product owner identifies the items from the backlog that are of high priority and would need to get done. In this meeting, the items are divided into tasks, and the development team estimates times for each task.
One thing that does come up on this is a lot of the teams that I've been on don't strictly estimate time. So like when they do the time estimate, they use like planning cards that are, they're basically poker cards to say how much effort relative to a sprint is this. Mm-hmm. So like, is it a 2 or is it a king? Usually if it's one of the face cards, obviously you have to go, okay, I need to split this task up, or we need to talk about it. And one of the big things that happens there is the team members will go, well, why is your view widely different than the rest of the team in either direction? So you can find ways that you can improve the ability to implement, or you can find things that, I didn't know about this whole other thing that's going to go sideways if we do this. Mm-hmm. And so it gets that out early instead of while you're coding. And the big thing with ours is developers are really, really bad at estimating.
Everyone is.
Yeah. But I mean, we're a little worse than normal. Like we can estimate things in a relative sense more than an absolute sense. And this forces the developers not to try to do it in an absolute sense.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense.
It's one of those little cognitive trick things.
Mm-hmm. So we've mentioned it a couple of times. I want to hit on what a sprint goal is. This is the objective to be met by the sprint. It gives guidance for the development team, and it's designed to be flexible on the implementation during the sprint. Speaking of during the sprint and sprint goals, there are no changes that risk the sprint goal are allowed during a sprint. And a sprint is typically 1 month or less to produce a viable product.
Yeah, and you don't want it any longer than a month. You really, I'm not even sure a month is not too long. I think it would depend on what you're doing. Yeah. And how big the team is and the difficulty level and everything else. It's just.
Usually these are 2 to 3 weeks long.
Yeah.
And
the best I've ever been on was 3 weeks.
Yeah. They may be canceled by the product owner if the sprint goal is no longer in scope of the project.
Yeah.
And they may only be canceled by the product owner. The work is typically divided up. The division that we have is stories, features, and tasks. So the story would be like maybe 1 or 2 stories per sprint.
Yeah.
Then that's divided up into features that are then subdivided into tasks that each person will claim and work on.
Yeah, the way I've seen it has been stories, features, and bugs. Mm-hmm. And so features and bugs are under a story as item types. Mm-hmm. So we don't get that deep. You
were probably working on stuff that was already built.
Some of it, yes.
Because we have bugs. I didn't put them in here just because this is a brand new product being built. So it's, bugs would be on the same level as tasks.
Yeah. And I guess that's kind of the thing is like the SLA considerations come up in there once the thing is live. Like Agile with a non-existent product is different than Agile with one that's already running and getting revenue.
Mm-hmm. And then we have what Will and I have talked about a few times, the daily scrum or daily stand-up. And these are supposed to be limited to 15 minutes in length. And each person on the team answers 3 questions what have you been working on since the last stand-up? What are you currently working on or about to work on? And what impedes your work?
Yep. And that's really all you need from a management perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can go back to their cubicles, not have long-term discussions about things that are not related to actually meeting deliverables.
Yes. And I will say, not only the Scrum Master, but several of the other team members are very good about, like, this. Our Scrum Master sets a timer for the meetings, and everyone answers the 3 questions. If they start to get off topic, she says, we can talk about that after the stand-up, but we need to stay on topic for the stand-up.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that's somewhat of a pain point where I'm working right now, because we do have a few individuals, and it varies per day, because sometimes I'm one of them, that get way off topic in meetings. And so our morning stand-up that should be 10 minutes frequently goes to about 50. And you get out of there and you're just beat. And it's 9:50 in the morning. You're going to lunch in an hour and you're already tired. And that's not something you want to create for your team. And so the thing with the sprint and with the whole thing with Agile, the sprint and the Scrum both do this, is they force you to have a short cadence for what you're doing, so you don't get off topic. Like it's the same thing at different scales. And if you use a Pomodoro timer while you're working on things, you tighten the scale that much more.
That's a good point.
It reflects all the way up.
So after the sprint, you have 2 meetings. The first is the sprint review, and this should be no longer than about 4 hours and can be shorter based on the length of the sprint. This is where the Scrum team, product owner, and any key stakeholders meet, and the owner explains what has been done, what has not been done, and then the team discusses what went well, what impediments they faced, and then there's a demonstration of the product as it is after the sprint. And it ends with a discussion of the product backlog and what to do next, or what to keep in mind for the next sprint planning.
Right, and that helps with prioritization. Of course, the other thing it helps too is like the discussion of impediments. This gets dropped a lot because in a lot of environments, you'll have somebody in upper management that goes, hey, let's go to Agile. And they don't really understand what Agile is. And you can always tell because their people aren't comfortable mentioning, hey, it would be nice if upper management would quit coming in here 4 times an hour and asking what I'm doing, because they don't feel like they can. So they're not completely agile, but the impediments I've found tend to be more informative as far as like actually making the team more effective than just about anything else. Every so often you'll get somebody that gets a good suggestion for how to actually improve something, but most people are like, no, how do we avoid loss? And it's very, very helpful.
And finally, you have the sprint retrospective, and this should be the last meeting that you have in that sprint. This is generally about 3 hours. It can be less depending, like I said, on the length of the sprint. But it's a review after the sprint is over, after the sprint review, but before the next sprint planning, where the Scrum team self-inspects and talks about what worked well, what didn't work well, and how to improve the process, what actions they can take on the next sprint to improve the process for the team.
Yeah, and this is different than the review, because this is not, or at least the way I've seen it, is this part doesn't include the product owners.
You're right. It does not include the product owner or any stakeholders. This is
the team. The
team facilitated by the Scrum Master.
Yeah, and what's weird about this is a lot of places don't have this formally, but if you have a multi-hour long meeting in the morning for your sprint review, what happens? Everybody goes to lunch and they have the retrospective anyway.
Yeah.
Like, this is just formalizing something that arises organically because of the way you do things.
And this is mostly about people, relationships, processes, and tools. You really want to look heavily into what went well and how to improve the things that didn't go well or that need improvement, and make a plan to implement those improvements for the next sprint.
Yeah, and some of those items in that plan will become actual tasks.
Mm-hmm. Like the first retrospective I went to with my job now, we each wrote on sticky notes, things that went well and things that could be improved, and then put them on a board, on a whiteboard wall.
Yeah.
But put them in columns, and then we talked about each one of them, and then the Scrum Master, when we got over to the actions we're going to take, divided it up into what needs to be done, what we need to stop doing, and what we need to maintain. And each one of those cards or sticky notes went into one of those three categories.
Yep.
For the plan.
I would put a fourth if I were them, and it would be things to think about before the next one.
That's good, because there was one thing that I mentioned that they said, well,
I've played this game before.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know how, basically I mentioned having a team calendar.
Yeah. And
she was like, I don't know if we can implement that or not, or how to do it. And so we decided to keep that off the board as something to look into. But that's your fourth column would be perfect for that.
Yeah.
And I'm probably going to bring that up at work tomorrow.
Yeah, you might as well. Blame me for it. I'm anonymous-ish.
I've talked about you enough. And I think there's a few people there that might know who you are. But anyway,
that's either good or bad.
They listen to the podcast. Hey, guys.
Yeah.
So that pretty much wraps it up. This was a bit of a shorter episode, part because we were able to get to all of the material, and part because we were kind of streamlining our own process in talking here. But before we wrap everything up, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, it kind of came out in Beej's outline, but so we talk about how things like the sprint retrospective happen naturally if you're following guidelines. Things like separation of concerns happen in object-oriented programming. Those happen if you're following the general principles, like those arise organically. And I want everybody to think about that just a little bit as you're looking at processes during your day, either your development, what you're actually working on, or the way that you do meetings, the way that your company conducts things, and start to think about the informal processes that form a lattice that supports the thing that you're doing. And the reason I bring this up is there's a great deal of career value in being able to actually formalize those things or be able to lead those things. Informal project structures, informal organizational structures, informal communication channels tend to be a way that you can leverage power a lot more efficiently than the actual official ones. So if you start looking for these things that arise organically in your process, a lot of times you'll find yourself being ahead of the people that don't think about it. This is how, people like the Gang of Four wrote design patterns. They didn't, come up with these patterns. They just noticed that, hey, if we follow the certain rules, all of a sudden these patterns just sort of come out of the ether. And we might as well formalize it and actually make something useful out of it and have a common nomenclature for it. And this works very, very well if you can get inside an organization and do that. Be able to pick out the organic patterns that come out of nowhere. So that's what I got. If you have a question or comment for us, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed under Creative Commons. The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up to our email list, be sure and check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with the news about the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time.